Close your eyes. This is a story designed to help you sleep. Tonight, you open a leather-bound ledger. The date on the first page is 1931. The handwriting is careful, deliberate, a banker's hand. But the bank whose name is embossed on the cover does not exist. It never did. And yet, its pages record millions of dollars in loans, deposits, and transactions that passed through a network of real banks, real businesses, real lives. You are about to trace a ghost through the financial history of the last century, a shadow bank that operated in the spaces between the official and the invisible. But first, let yourself be completely at ease. Breathe in slowly, and out. Let the rhythm of the rain become the only sound. There is nothing to solve right now. Just let the story unfold, as you drift deeper into rest. The rain had been falling since early morning, a soft, persistent drizzle that turned the gravel lanes of the countryside to mud and misted the windows of the old barn where the auction was being held. You could hear it tapping on the tin roof above you, a steady, patient rhythm that seemed to muffle every other sound, the murmur of the small crowd, the shuffle of feet on the straw-covered floor, the distant lowing of cattle from the farm next door. The air inside the barn was cool and damp, carrying the smell of wet wool and old wood and the faint, sweet scent of hay that had been baled and stored in the loft above. Somewhere near the front, a child laughed, and the sound echoed briefly through the high, vaulted space before being swallowed by the rain. You had not planned to come to this auction. You had been driving through the valley on a weekend trip, following the winding country roads with no particular destination in mind, the windshield wipers keeping their slow, steady time, the radio playing old songs that crackled with static whenever you passed through a hollow. The landscape had been beautiful in a quiet, understated way, rolling hills patched with green and gold, old stone walls running along the edges of fields, the occasional farmhouse with smoke curling from its chimney. And then, at the side of the road, a hand-painted sign. Estate auction, it read, the letters slightly smeared by the rain, with an arrow pointing down a narrow gravel lane that disappeared into a stand of bare oak trees. You had turned the wheel almost without thinking, drawn by the quiet, hopeful curiosity that always accompanies the prospect of finding something unexpected among other people's forgotten things. The auctioneer was an old man with a gray beard and a voice that had been worn rough by years of calling bids. He stood on a makeshift platform at the front of the barn, a wooden gavel in his hand, working through the lots with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing this for decades. His rhythm was almost musical, the rising pitch of his call, the pause, the decisive crack of the gavel. Furniture went first. An old oak dresser, its mirror still intact. A set of dining chairs, their seats worn smooth. Farm equipment followed, rusted plow blades, a butter churn, coils of barbed wire. Then came the smaller things. Boxes of china wrapped in old newspaper, their patterns faded but still elegant. A collection of oil lamps, their brass fittings tarnished but still beautiful. A shoebox full of old postcards, their images of distant cities faded to pastel ghosts. You browsed the tables at the back of the barn, running your fingers over the spines of old books and the handles of rusted tools, enjoying the quiet pleasure of examining things that had once been loved and were now waiting for someone to love them again. The rain continued its steady percussion on the tin roof, a sound that seemed to wrap itself around the barn like a blanket, holding the world outside at a distance. You picked up a small porcelain figurine, a shepherd boy with a flute, and turned it over in your hands, wondering who had once displayed it on a mantelpiece, who had dusted it on quiet afternoons. You set it down gently and moved on. The box of books was sitting on the floor, half hidden beneath a table draped with a faded floral cloth. It was not a large box, just a simple cardboard carton, its corners reinforced with yellowed packing tape that had long since lost its grip and was peeling away in dry, brittle curls. A handwritten sign taped to its side read books, ASIS, $5, the letters formed with a black marker that had bled slightly into the porous cardboard. You knelt down, feeling the cold dampness of the straw-covered floor seep through the knees of your trousers, and began to sort through the contents. Most of what you found was unremarkable. A worn copy of Moby Dick, its spine cracked and its pages dog-eared, a faded bookmark still lodged between the chapters where some long-ago reader had paused and never returned. A collection of Reader's Digest condensed novels from the 1960s, their covers bright with illustrations of faraway places. A Bible with a torn cover and a faded inscription on the flyleaf, "To Margaret, on her confirmation, with love from Mother, 1947. A stack of old farming almanacs, their pages yellowed and brittle, filled with lunar charts and planting advice that had not been relevant for half a century. You turned each one over in your hands, feeling the dry, fragile texture of the old paper, and set them aside. But at the very bottom of the box, beneath all the other books, your fingers brushed against something different. Something heavier. The cardboard had sagged under the weight of the volumes above it, and this last object had been pressed flat against the bottom, hidden from view. You pushed the other books aside, the almanacs, the Bible, the novels, and lifted it out with both hands. It was a ledger. Bound in dark, aged leather, its surface worn smooth in places from years of handling and cracked in others where the leather had dried and split along the grain. The corners were reinforced with brass caps that had lost their shine long ago, dulled now to a soft, muted brown. The spine was still solid, the binding intact, and when you held it in your hands, you could feel the weight of it, the physical gravity of a book that had been made to last, made by hands that had understood that some records were meant to endure. The leather was cool and slightly rough beneath your fingertips, and it smelled faintly of old paper and dust and something else, something faint and sweet, like beeswax or old varnish. The cover was embossed with a name, the letters still legible despite the decades of wear. Pacific Trust Savings Bank. The words were stamped deep into the leather, the gold leaf that had once filled them now almost entirely worn away, leaving only the faintest trace of its former gleam. Beneath the name was a symbol you did not recognize, an odd, stylized bird, perhaps a pelican, its wings spread wide as if in flight or protection, encircled by a ring of laurel leaves. The symbol was unfamiliar. You had never seen it on any currency, any stock certificate, any of the financial documents you had encountered in your life. It belonged to a world you did not know. You opened the cover. The spine gave a soft creak, a sound like the clearing of a throat before a long-awaited story. The first page was blank except for a single line of handwritten text, the ink faded over the years to a pale, watery brown, the color of strong tea left too long in the cup. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, the hand of someone who had been trained to write well, who had taken his time with each letter. The date was January 3, 1931. The middle of the Great Depression. Banks were failing across the country. People were losing everything. And beneath the date, in the same steady hand, were the words that made your breath catch in your throat. This institution is not governed by the Federal Reserve Act. All transactions are settled in gold. You read the sentence twice. The rain drummed softly on the tin roof above you, a sound that seemed to lean closer, as if it too was reading over your shoulder. The auctioneer's gavel struck somewhere in the distance, a sharp, final sound, and a murmur of voices rose and fell. Someone had just bought something. Someone had just become the new owner of a piece of someone else's past. But you were barely aware of any of it. Your attention was fixed on the page before you, on the words that should not have existed. In 1931, private ownership of gold had been restricted by executive order. Banks were not permitted to settle transactions in gold. And yet here, in this ledger, was a declaration of independence from the entire federal banking system. You turned the page, and the next, and the next. Columns of figures. Names you did not recognize. Dates stretching across months and years. Transactions recorded with a precision and regularity that spoke of serious, ongoing purpose. This was not a personal journal. This was not a hobbyist's notebook. This was the financial record of a bank. A bank that had operated in the shadows, outside the law, for who knew how many years. A bank that, you were beginning to suspect, had never officially existed at all. The rain had followed you home from the auction. It drummed softly against the window of your study, a sound that had accompanied you through the long afternoon and into the evening, a quiet, persistent rhythm that seemed to blur the boundary between the world outside and the world within. The street lamps along your road had flickered on some time in the last hour, and their amber glow filtered through the rain-streaked glass, casting long, wavering shadows across the wooden floor. The house was quiet. The clock on the mantel ticked with its familiar, unhurried patience, marking the passage of time in a room that had seen many such nights and would see many more. The ledger sat on your desk, its leather cover dark and worn, its brass corners catching the amber glow of the desk lamp. You had placed it there hours ago, after carrying it carefully from the car, after setting it down and stepping back and looking at it for a long moment, as if it were a guest who had arrived uninvited and was waiting to be offered a seat. The book seemed to hold the lamplight differently than the objects around it, soaking it in rather than reflecting it back, as if the leather had been conditioned by years of handling to absorb light rather than repel it. There was something patient about it. Something that had been waiting a long time and was in no hurry now. You had made coffee, more out of habit than need, and it sat now at your elbow, long since gone cold. A thin, iridescent skin had formed on its surface, the way it does when coffee has been sitting for hours. You had not touched it. Your attention had been elsewhere, first on the cover, with its embossed name and its strange pelican symbol, and then on the first page, with its impossible Declaration of Independence from the Federal Reserve. This institution is not governed by the Federal Reserve Act. All transactions are settled in gold. The words had been sitting in your mind all afternoon, like a stone dropped into still water, its ripples still spreading. Now, with the evening deepening into night and the rain showing no sign of letting up, you opened the ledger again. The spine crackled softly as you lifted the cover, a sound like dry leaves stirring in a breeze, or like the clearing of a throat before a long-awaited story. The pages were yellowed and brittle at the edges, the paper having grown fragile with age, and you had to handle them with care, turning each one as gently as you might turn the wing of a moth. The ink had faded over the decades from black to a soft, watery brown, the color of strong tea left too long in the cup, the color of old photographs and older memories. But the handwriting was still legible. Careful. Deliberate. The hand of someone who had been trained to keep records, who had understood that these words might matter someday, to someone. The first entry was dated January 3, 1931. The middle of the Great Depression. Banks were failing across the country, their doors shuttered, their depositors left with nothing. Unemployment was climbing past 20%. Red lines stretched around city blocks. And here, in this quiet ledger, was a record of business as usual, as if the economic catastrophe outside had no bearing on the transactions within. It recorded a loan of $5,000 to a small freight company based in Oakland, a business you had never heard of. The terms were generous, low interest, extended repayment, no collateral listed on the main page. It was the kind of loan that a legitimate bank would not have made in those dark years, when businesses were failing by the thousands and credit had all but frozen. And yet, here it was, written in steady ink, as if the banker who had approved it had no reason to doubt that it would be repaid. You turned the page. More loans followed, each one recorded with the same meticulous precision. A shipping company in Seattle granted $8,000 at 2% interest. A textile mill in Portland, its loan described simply as operating capital. A farm cooperative in the Central Valley, its members identified only by the code names assigned to them in the ledger. Each entry followed the same format, date, amount, borrower, terms, and each was written in the same steady hand. Whoever had kept this book had been doing so for a long time, and he had never wavered in his attention to detail. The rain continued its steady, patient rhythm against the window. You listened to it for a moment, letting the sound settle around you like a blanket. The house creaked softly as the wind shifted outside, a familiar sound, the sound of old timbers adjusting to the night's cold. The lamp on your desk hummed its quiet, electrical note. You turned another page. It was the source of the funds that caught your attention next. The deposits that backed these loans did not come from ordinary checking accounts or savings certificates. They did not come from businesses or corporations or any of the usual channels. They came from a network of private individuals, each one identified not by name but by a code. Bluebird, Sparrow, Raven, Nightingale. Each depositor had contributed substantial sums, thousands of dollars, in some cases tens of thousands, and each contribution was recorded with the same quiet discretion as the loans themselves. There were no addresses, no contact information, no way to trace who these people were or where their money had come from. Just the code names, written in careful ink, like the aliases of secret agents in a spy novel. The amounts were staggering. Bluebird alone had deposited over $50,000, a fortune in 1931, when the average American worker earned less than $2,000 a year. Sparrow had contributed nearly as much. Raven, whose entries appeared somewhat later, had deposited smaller sums but with greater frequency, as if you were contributing from ongoing income rather than a single store of wealth. Together, the depositors had provided the capital for dozens of loans, all of which appeared to have been repaid in full, with interest, over the years that followed. You leaned back in your chair. The wood creaked softly beneath your weight, a sound as familiar as the ticking of the clock. Outside, the rain had softened to a gentle drizzle, its rhythm now a whisper rather than a drumming. The street lamp beyond your window had blurred into a soft, gold smudge against the dark. The ledger lay open on the desk before you, its pages filled with the quiet, meticulous record of a bank that should not have existed. And then, as you turned back to the very first entry, the loan to the Oakland Freight Company, you noticed something you had not seen before. In the margin, squeezed into the narrow space beside the main text, was a note. The handwriting was different from the rest of the page, smaller, more hurried, as if it had been added later, perhaps in haste, perhaps by a different hand. The ink was the same watery brown, but the letters were less careful, the strokes more rushed. Collateral, Warehouse 3, San Francisco Docks. Redeemable by key. You read the words twice. The rain tapped gently on the window. The clock ticked on the mantel. And then, as you tilted the ledger toward the lamp, letting the light fall across the page at a sharper angle, you saw something else. Tucked into the crease of the binding, its edge just barely visible against the yellowed paper, was a key. You drew it out carefully, feeling the slight resistance of the old paper as it released its hold. The key was small, no larger than the first joint of your thumb, and made of brass that had tarnished over the years to a deep, muted brown. The metal was cool and solid in your palm, heavier than it looked, its surface worn smooth in places where countless fingers had held it. And on the handle, engraved in tiny, precise numbers that caught the amber light of the desk lamp, was a single digit. 3. The key lay in your hand, small and heavy and patient. The ledger lay open before you, its pages filled with the names of birds. And somewhere, on the docks of San Francisco, a warehouse with the number 3 above its door was waiting. It had been waiting, you realized, since 1931. Waiting for someone to find this book, to find this key, and to follow the trail all the way to its end. The key sat on your desk for 3 days before you touched it again. It was not hesitation, exactly. It was something closer to patience, a sense that the key, and whatever door it opened, was not going anywhere. The warehouse it belonged to had been waiting since 1931, waiting through the Depression and the war and the long, slow decades that followed. It could wait a little longer. And you, sitting at your desk with the rain drumming softly against the window and the house quiet around you, needed time to think. Time to let the questions settle into something you could begin to answer. On the first day, you simply looked at the key. You turned it over in your fingers, feeling its familiar weight, tracing the worn edges of the brass, reading the number engraved on its handle until the shape of it was burned into your memory. 3, a single digit. A small, quiet clue. On the second day, You opened the ledger again and read through the entries that referenced the warehouse. The collateral notes were always the same. Warehouse 3, San Francisco Docks. Redeemable by key. The handwriting never changed. The confidence of the banker who had written those words never wavered. Whatever was in that warehouse, it was valuable enough to secure loans totaling tens of thousands of dollars. And yet, no one had ever come to claim it. The key had sat in the binding of the ledger for decades, untouched, waiting. On the third day, with the rain still falling in its steady, unhurried way and the gray light of a late autumn afternoon filtering through the window, you sat down at your desk and began to search. The key lay beside the ledger, its brass surface catching the amber glow of the desk lamp. The number 3, engraved on its handle, seemed to pulse with a quiet significance, a question that had been waiting a very long time for an answer. You opened your laptop, the screen glowing pale blue in the dim room, and typed San Francisco Docks Warehouse 3 1930s into the search bar. The results C. Aimed slowly at first. San Francisco's waterfront had been rebuilt many times over the decades, the Great Earthquake and Fire of 1906, the construction of the Bay Bridge in the 1930s, the wartime boom of the 1940s, the decline of the shipping industry in the latter half of the century. Each era had left its mark, and each mark had been overridden by the next. Finding a single warehouse in all that history was like looking for a specific grain of sand on a very large beach. But there were fragments. Old maps, digitized by the public library, their parchment surfaces scanned at high resolution. Shipping manifests, preserved in maritime archives, their typewritten entries fading but still legible. And there, in a collection of photographs from the port of San Francisco's historical archive, was a reference to the numbered warehouses. They had been built in the 1920s, a row of identical brick structures along the Embarcadero, each one marked with a number above its heavy iron door. Warehouses 1 through 8. They had been used by shipping companies, freight forwarders, and import-export firms for decades, their walls witnessing the flow of goods from every corner of the world. The photographs showed them as solid, unremarkable buildings, their brick facades darkened by years of coal smoke and sea salt. Each warehouse had its own story, its own network of connections. But Warehouse 3, according to the official records, had been destroyed. A fire, the document said, had swept through the dock district in the autumn of 1942. The war was raging in Europe and the Pacific, and the waterfront was busier than it had ever been. Security was tight. Records were sparse. But the fire, whatever its cause, had leveled 3 of the 8 warehouses. Numbers 2, 3, and 4 had been reduced to ash and rubble. The site had been cleared by the Army Corps of Engineers in early 1943, the debris carted away, and the land had sat vacant for years before a new pier was built over it in the 1950s. There was nothing left to find. The key in your hand was a key to a door that no longer existed. The story, it seemed, had reached its end before it had even begun. You leaned back in your chair. The wood creaked softly beneath your weight, a sound as familiar as the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Outside, the rain had softened to a gentle drizzle, its rhythm now a whisper rather than a drumming. The street lamp beyond your window had blurred into a soft, gold smudge against the darkening sky. The ledger lay open on the desk before you, its pages filled with entries that continued well past 1942. You turned to the entries from 1943. The loans were still being recorded. The collateral was still listed as Warehouse 3, San Francisco Docks. The key was still referenced. If the warehouse had been destroyed, why was it still being used? D as security. Why was the bank, this shadow bank that should not have existed, still treating it as a viable asset? You turned to 1944. More entries. More references to Warehouse 3. 1945, the same. The handwriting never changed. The confidence never wavered. The rain seemed to grow a little louder for a moment, as if it too was leaning in to listen over your shoulder. You turned back to your laptop and began to search again. Not for the fire itself. For the warehouse after the fire. For any record, any mention, any fragment of evidence that Warehouse 3 had survived. The search took hours. The rain came and went, its rhythm shifting from soft to insistent and back again. The clock on the mantel marked the passing hours with its steady, unhurried tick. The coffee at your elbow grew cold, and you replaced it with a fresh cup, and that cup grew cold as well. And then, buried deep in a collection of maritime insurance records from 1946, documents that had been scanned and uploaded by a historical society in Oakland, their pages yellowed and their type faded, you found something that made your hand pause on the keyboard. It was a photograph. Black and white, grainy, taken from the deck of a ship moored at the Embarcadero. The photograph showed a row of warehouses along the waterfront. The angle was slightly off, as if the photographer had been in a hurry, or as if the ship had been moving when the shutter clicked. But the image was clear enough. Warehouse 1 stood at the far left, its door open, a truck backed up to its loading dock. Warehouse 2 stood beside it, its windows dark. And there, between Warehouse 2 and Warehouse 4, stood Warehouse 3. Its brick walls were intact. Its iron door was closed. Its number was clearly visible above the doorframe, the numerals slightly tilted, as if it had been hanging there for years and had never been disturbed. The photograph was dated March 1946. For years after the fire that had supposedly destroyed it. You stared at the image for a long moment. The rain drummed softly on the window. The clock ticked on the mantel. The key lay on the desk beside the ledger, its brass surface glowing faintly in the amber light. The fire had never happened. Or if it had, Warehouse 3 had not been among the buildings that burned. Someone had falsified the records, the fire report, the property records, the insurance claims, the official maps. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to erase Warehouse 3 from existence. Someone had wanted the world to believe that whatever was inside that building was gone forever. Yo. You printed the photograph. The old inkjet printer on the shelf beside your desk whirred to life, its mechanisms clicking and humming, and after a moment, it produced a copy of the image. The paper was warm from the printer's heat, and the photograph, in its physical form, seemed more real than it had on the screen. You set it on the desk beside the ledger and the key. 3 objects, arranged in a row. The ledger, with its careful records of a bank that had never existed. The key, with its single engraved digit. And the photograph, with its quiet proof that Warehouse 3 was still out there, waiting. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the glass. The clock ticked on the mantel. And you understood, with a quiet certainty that settled over you like the sound of the rain itself, that you were going to San Francisco. You were going to find Warehouse 3. And you were going to use the key. The flight to San Francisco took just over 4 hours. You spent most of them looking out the window, watching the land give way to cloud and then to the vast, gray sweep of the Pacific. The rain was waiting for you when you landed, a soft, coastal drizzle that misted the windows of the taxi and blurred the edges of the city into something soft and impressionistic, as if the whole world had been painted in watercolor and left to dry in the damp air. The driver did not speak, and you did not ask him to. You simply gave him the address you had found in the old maritime records and sat back as the city unfolded around you. The key was in your pocket, its brass surface warm against your thigh, a small, quiet weight that reminded you with every passing mile of why you had come. The neighborhood changed as you approached the waterfront. The gleaming towers of downtown, with their glass facades and their busy sidewalks, gave way to older, grimmer buildings, warehouses and shipping offices and the kinds of bars that had no signs and needed none. The streets grew narrower, the potholes deeper, the street lamps fewer and farther between. The fog, never far from this part of the city, began to roll in from the bay in slow, silent waves, curling around the corners of buildings and drifting through the gaps in the chain-link fences. You could smell the salt in the air, and the faint, metallic tang of rust, and the clean, cold scent of the sea. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp and lonely in the gray afternoon light. The taxi dropped you at the end of a long, empty street. The driver hesitated for a moment, looking at the abandoned warehouses and the cracked pavement and the fog that was growing thicker by the minute. "You sure this is the place?" he asked. You told him you were sure. He shrugged, took your money, and drove away, his taillights disappearing into the mist. You were alone. The pavement was cracked and patched, and weeds pushed through every seam, their stalks yellow and brittle in the cold autumn air. To your left, a chain-link fence separated the road from the waterfront, its posts leaning at odd angles, its surface rusted and torn in places. Beyond it, you could hear the gentle lapping of water against stone, the bay, invisible in the fog but still present, still breathing. To your right, a row of warehouses stood in various states of decay. Some had been boarded up entirely, their windows dark, their doors sealed with heavy padlocks that had rusted into solid masses of iron. Others had been repurposed, artist studios, perhaps, or storage units, their facades brightened with murals and graffiti that seemed to glow faintly in the gray light. But at the far end of the row, half hidden by the fog, was a warehouse that had been neither boarded up nor repurposed. It simply stood there, silent and patient, as if it had been waiting for someone to come and notice it again. Its brick walls were dark with age and moisture, streaked with long, vertical stains where decades of rain had run down from the roof. The mortar between the bricks had crumbled in places, and small tufts of green moss grew from the cracks. The iron door was closed, its surface pitted with rust, its hinges massive and dark. And above the door, mounted on a small iron bracket that had been bent slightly by years of wind, the number 3 was still visible. Its white paint had faded to a pale, chalky gray, and one edge of the numeral had chipped away, but it was unmistakable. This was the place. You walked toward it slowly, feeling the key in your pocket, its brass surface warm against your fingers. The fog grew thicker as you approached, muffling the sounds of the city until the only thing you could hear was your own footsteps on the cracked pavement and the distant, mournful call of a foghorn somewhere out on the bay, a low, resonant note that seemed to hang in the air for a long time before fading. The warehouse loomed above you, dark and solid, its walls seeming to absorb the gray light rather than reflect it. You stopped in front of the iron door. It was heavier than you had expected, its surface rough and cold beneath your palm. You pulled the key from your pocket, feeling its familiar weight. The number 3 on its handle seemed to glow faintly in the gray light, as if it recognized where it was. You fitted the key into the lock. It slid in smoothly, without resistance, as if the mechanism had been oiled recently, or as if it had been waiting so long that it was eager to turn. You turned the key. The lock released with a deep, resonant click that seemed to echo through the empty street, a sound that was final and satisfying and somehow alive. You pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, a low, reluctant sound, and the iron door swung inward, revealing the darkness within. The warehouse was dark. The only light came from the doorway behind you and from a few high windows. Set into the brick walls near the roof, their glass so grimed with decades of salt spray and soot that the gray afternoon light barely penetrated, falling in thin, pale shafts that seemed to dissolve before they reached the floor. Dust lay thick on every surface, a soft, gray blanket that had been undisturbed for years, decades, perhaps longer. The air was cold and still, smelling of old wood and rust and something faintly sweet, like the ghost of a cigar smoked long ago by someone who had sat at a desk and waited. The space was almost entirely empty. The vast floor, which had once held cargo and crates and the busy commerce of a working port, the shouts of longshoremen, the creak of wooden pallets, the rumble of trucks backing up to the loading dock, was bare. The concrete was cracked in places, and small, pale weeds had pushed through the gaps, their leaves stretching toward the distant light. The walls were lined with empty shelves, their surfaces coated in dust. And in the center of the room, alone and patient, as if it had been placed there deliberately and then forgotten, stood a single wooden desk. Behind the desk, a chair. The wood was dark and worn, its seat shaped by years of use. And on the desk, covered in a thin layer of dust, were 2 objects. A telegraph machine, its brass fittings tarnished but intact, its keys still movable, its wires still coiled neatly beside it. And a stack of blank paper, its edges yellowed, waiting for messages that had never been sent. You crossed the room slowly, your footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. The sound seemed too loud in the silence, and you found yourself walking more softly, as if you were in a library or a church. The desk was solid and heavy, its surface scarred with the faint impressions of pens and coffee cups. You wiped the dust away with the sleeve of your coat, revealing the dark, polished wood beneath. The telegraph machine was in remarkable condition, its brass keys still bright in places where the tarnish had not reached, its mechanism still smooth when you pressed one of the keys. Beside it, on a small metal stand, was a logbook. Leather-bound, its pages yellowed with age. You opened it carefully, feeling the dry, brittle paper beneath your fingers. The entries were brief, dates, times, short messages sent and received. And the last entry, written in the same careful hand, was dated 1962. Cease all transactions. Transfer ledgers to trustee. Await reactivation order. Beneath the message, a signature. Not a name. A code. Pelican. If your eyes are growing heavy, let the dust settle back over the desk. The warehouse has waited for 80 years. It can wait a little longer. Close your eyes. Listen to the foghorn out on the bay, low and steady, like a lullaby sung over the water. The questions will still be here when you wake. The telegraph key will still be here. The silence will still be here, patient and still. The reactivation order had never come. The trustee had never been named, or if they had, their name was not recorded in this logbook. The bank had shut down, its operations suspended, its ledgers transferred to someone whose identity was known only to a person who signed their messages with the name of a bird. Pelican. The same bird that was embossed on the cover of the ledger. The same symbol that had appeared again and again in the records. Whoever Pelican was, they had been the one to close this place. And whoever they had trusted to carry on the work had never returned to finish it. You stood there for a long moment, the logbook open in your hands, the fog pressing against the high windows, the silence of the warehouse wrapped around you like a blanket. And you wondered who Pelican was. And whether they were still waiting, somewhere, for someone to come and ask them what happened next. The telegraph machine had fallen silent, but the word it had left behind echoed in your mind all the way back to your hotel. Pelican. The same symbol that was embossed on the cover of the ledger, a bird with wings spread wide, encircled by a ring of laurel leaves. The same code that had signed the final entry in the logbook, the message that had shut down the shadow bank in 1962 and had been waiting, ever since, for a reactivation order that never came. Whoever Pelican was, they had been important enough to close the bank. Important enough to transfer the ledgers to a trustee whose name was never recorded. Important enough to leave a message that had waited 60 years for someone to find it. Now, sitting at the small desk in your hotel room with the rain tapping gently against the window and the distant foghorn sounding its low, mournful note across the bay, you opened the ledger once more. The room was warm and quiet, the radiator humming its soft, metallic song, the street lamp outside casting a pale amber glow through the thin curtains. You had brought the ledger with you from home, wrapped in its oilcloth, and it lay open on the desk before you, its pages yellowed and familiar. But tonight, you were not looking at the entries, the loans, the deposits, the careful columns of numbers that had first drawn you into this story. Tonight, you were looking for something else. You were looking for the signatures. Each transaction in the ledger had been initialed by someone, a small, almost illegible scrawl in the corner of the page, squeezed into the margin beside the date. You had noticed these markings before, but you had not studied them. They had seemed incidental, a formality, the kind of notation that any careful bookkeeper might make. But now, turning through the pages one by one, comparing the marks across months and years, you began to see a pattern. The smaller transactions, the modest loans, the routine deposits, bore a variety of initials. Different hands, differ. NT pens, different moments in time. But the larger transactions, the ones involving substantial sums, the ones that had made this shadow bank something more than a simple credit union, all bore the same set of initials. The same letters, written in the same hand, over and over again, stretching back to the very first entry in 1931. And those initials, you realized as you compared them to the signature at the bottom of the telegraph log, belonged to Pelican. The rain continued its steady, patient rhythm against the glass. The radiator clicked once, twice, and then fell silent. The foghorn sounded again, somewhere far out on the bay, its note hanging in the air for a long moment before fading. You turned another page, and another, following the trail of Pelican's initials through the years of the bank's operation. They appeared on the first loan, to the Oakland Freight Company. They appeared on the deposits from the codenamed investors, Bluebird, Sparrow, Raven, Nightingale. They appeared on the final entry in 1962, the one that had closed the bank and transferred the ledgers to the unknown trustee. Pelican had been there at the beginning. Pelican had been there at the end. And Pelican, you suspected, had been the one who had kept the whole operation together through the long, dark years of the Depression and the war and the decades that followed. You leaned back in your chair. The wood creaked softly beneath your weight. Outside, the rain had softened to a fine mist, barely visible in the amber glow of the street lamp. You turned another page, and then another, and then, tucked between two pages near the middle of the ledger, between an entry from 1947 and an entry from 1948, you found something you had not noticed before. It was a small slip of paper, yellowed and brittle, folded once. You drew it out carefully, feeling the dry, fragile texture of the old paper beneath your fingertips. You unfolded it. The handwriting was different from the ledger entries, more hurried, more personal, written in ink that had faded to a pale, watery brown. Just a single line. Pelican takes breakfast the first Sunday of every month. Table by the window. St. Francis Hotel. You read the words twice. The rain tapped gently on the window. The radiator hummed its quiet, steady note. The St. Francis Hotel was one of the oldest and most prestigious in San Francisco. You had passed it on your way to the warehouse, a grand, white structure on Union Square. Its facade adorned with flags and awnings, its lobby filled with chandeliers and marble columns and the quiet, discreet elegance of old money. It was the kind of place where politicians and business magnates and the quietly powerful gathered to conduct their affairs away from the public eye. If Pelican had been meeting someone there, they had been doing so in plain sight, hiding behind the veil of respectability that the hotel provided. The following Sunday, you walked through the gilded doors of the St. Francis. The lobby was vast and hushed, its marble floors polished to a mirror shine, its chandeliers casting a warm, golden light across the plush carpets and the deep leather armchairs. The air smelled of fresh flowers and old wood and the faint, pleasant scent of expensive cologne. Guests moved through the space in quiet conversation, their voices low and measured. You felt out of place, a stranger in a world that did not belong to you, but you kept walking, following the signs to the dining room. The head waiter was an older man, perhaps in his 60s, with silver hair combed neatly back in a posture that spoke of decades in service. His name, according to the small brass pin on his lapel, was Mr. Aldrich. He regarded you with a calm, practiced courtesy, his hands folded behind his back. "I'm looking for someone," you said. "Someone who used to come here a long time ago. On the first Sunday of every month. Table by the window." Mr. Aldrich's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes, a small, quiet recognition. And who might that be? You showed him the slip of paper. He looked at it for a long moment, his face unreadable. The chandeliers hummed their soft, electrical note. The distant clink of silverware on china drifted from the dining room beyond. And then, very quietly, he spoke. "Pelican," he said. "I haven't heard that name in a very long time." He paused, folding his hands more tightly behind his back. "Pelican is not a person. It's a room. Number 504. That room has never been checked out of, not once, in all the years I've worked here. Even during the renovations in the 1980s, they skipped that floor. That room. The bills are paid automatically, every month, from an offshore trust. They've been paid since 1973. He looked at you, and there was something in his eyes, curiosity, perhaps, or the quiet recognition of a mystery that had finally found its way to an answer. Would you like to see it? The elevator ride to the 5th floor was silent. Mr. Aldrich stood beside you, his hands still folded behind his back, his expression carefully neutral, the look of a man who had spent decades in service and had learned to keep his curiosity to himself. The elevator was old, its brass buttons worn smooth by the touch of 1,000 fingers, its mirrored walls reflecting the two of you in soft, amber-toned shadows. It rose with a quiet, mechanical hum, a sound that seemed to belong to another era, the era of the hotel's founding, perhaps, when elevators were still a novelty and their operators wore white gloves and announced each floor with a practiced courtesy. When the doors slid open, they revealed a corridor that had the hushed, timeless quality of a place where time had been persuaded to wait. The carpet was thick and deep burgundy, its pattern faded but still elegant, a repeating motif of fleur-de-lis and scrolling vines that had been walked upon by generations of guests. The walls were lined with brass sconces that cast a warm, golden light, their bulbs flickering almost imperceptibly, as if they too were breathing. The air smelled faintly of old wood and fresh flowers, a vase of white lilies on a side table, their petals just beginning to brown at the edges, and something else, something dry and sweet, like the pages of a very old book. The silence here was different from the silence of the warehouse. That silence had been empty, hollow, the silence of abandonment. This silence was full. It was the silence of a place that had been kept, tended, preserved against the passage of time. You followed Mr. Aldrich down the corridor, your footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The hallway seemed longer than it should have been, the doors spaced farther apart than in a modern hotel. Each door was heavy wood, dark with age, its brass numbers polished to a soft gleam. You passed 501, 502, 503. And then Mr. Aldrich stopped before a door marked 504. It looked no different fr. The others, the same dark wood, the same brass number, the same heavy, old-fashioned lock. But there was something about it. A stillness. A waiting. Mr. Aldrich reached into his pocket and produced a key. It was not the electronic card that most hotels use now, the kind you tap against a sensor and discard when you leave. It was an old-fashioned brass key, heavy and solid, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. It had been made for this door, and this door alone. He inserted it into the lock. The mechanism turned with a soft, well-oiled click, a sound that was satisfying and final and somehow alive. He pushed the door open and stepped aside, gesturing for you to enter. The room beyond was frozen in time. The furniture was not merely old, it was preserved, as if the occupant had stepped out for a moment and was expected back at any time. A dark wood desk stood against one wall, its surface scarred with the faint impressions of pens and coffee cups. A reading chair, upholstered in faded green velvet that had been brushed and cared for, sat beside a window that looked out over Union Square, the gray afternoon light filtering through the heavy brocade curtains. A coffee table with gently curved legs held a single object, a ceramic ashtray, clean and empty, waiting for a cigar that would never be lit. A wardrobe stood in a corner, its doors slightly ajar. The room was clean. Impeccably so. The dust had been kept at bay by hands that had entered this room once a month for decades, polishing the wood, airing the linens, replacing the flowers. The sheets on the bed were crisp and white, their corners folded with military precision. The rug on the floor was a deep, muted red, its pattern a geometric design that had been fashionable in the years after the war. Everything was as it should have been. Everything was waiting. You walked slowly into the room, feeling the weight of its history press around you. The air was still and cool, carrying the faint scent of old paper and beeswax and the distant, floral trace of the lilies in the hallway. You crossed to the desk. On its surface, beside a heavy, old-fashioned typewriter, its keys worn but clean, its roller holding a single sheet of blank paper, sat a second ledger. It was identical to the one you carried with you now, the one that had been sitting in your hotel room, wrapped in its oilcloth. The same dark leather, worn smooth at the corners. The same brass caps, dulled to a soft, muted brown. The same embossed pelican on the cover, its wings spread wide, encircled by a ring of laurel leaves. You reached out and touched it, feeling the cool, familiar texture of the leather beneath your finger. Tips. Then you opened the cover. The handwriting was the same. Pelican's hand. The same careful, deliberate letters that had filled the first ledger, the loans, the deposits, the code names of the anonymous benefactors. But this ledger was different. It was not a record of assets. It was not a record of money received and money lent and interest calculated. It was a record of debts. Not debts owed to the bank. Debts owed by the bank. Promises that had been made, not with the expectation of repayment, but as gifts. Loans that had been given to people who could never have qualified for credit at any legitimate institution, widows, immigrants, farmers whose crops had failed, small business owners whose dreams had been crushed by the Depression. Each entry was brief, but each told a story. A name. An amount. And in the margin, a single word, written in Pelican's steady hand. Forgiven. You turned the pages slowly, feeling the dry, fragile paper beneath your fingers. The rain had begun to fall again outside, tapping gently against the window, a sound that seemed to wrap itself around the silence rather than break it. Mr. Aldrich had withdrawn to the corridor, giving you space, giving you time. You turned another page, and another, until you reached the very end of the ledger. The last page was titled, simply, The List of Names. Nearly 100 of them, written in careful columns, the ink faded but still legible. Each name represented a life that had been touched by the shadow bank. Each name was a story of survival, of a hand extended in the dark, of a gift that had never been asked for and had never been repaid. And there, in the middle of the list, written in the same careful ink as all the others, was a name you knew. Your great-grandmother's name. The woman who had lost everything in the crash of 1929, her savings, her home, her husband's small business. The woman who, according to the family stories that had been passed down through the generations, had miraculously kept her house, even as her neighbors lost theirs. The miracle, you understood now, had a name. It was called Pacific Trust. It was called Pelican. It was called the quiet, invisible work of a bank that had never existed, run by people who had never sought recognition, extending credit to those who had no collateral to offer except their need. The rain tapped gently against the window. The room was silent. The typewriter waited on the desk. The ledger lay open in your hands. And you understood, with a quiet certainty that settled over you like the sound of the rain itself, that the debt after all these years was not a debt at all. It was a gift. A gift that had been waiting, patiently, for someone to come and remember it. The list of names from the second ledger stayed with you long after you left the St. Francis Hotel. You had copied them carefully into a small notebook, nearly 100 names, each one representing a life that had been touched by the shadow bank, each one a story that had been hidden for decades, waiting in the dark for someone to come and uncover it. The rain had stopped by the time you walked out onto Union Square, but the sky was still gray, the pavement still wet, the air still carrying that clean, cold scent of the sea that seemed to be woven into the fabric of this city. The palms in the square glistened with moisture, their fronds dripping slowly onto the cobblestones. You walked for a while, letting the city move around you, the cable cars clanging their distant bells, the tourists huddled under awnings, the pigeons scattering and regrouping in the gray light, before finding a quiet cafe on a side street, a small place with steamed-up windows and the smell of roasting coffee, where you could sit and think and begin to trace the threads that Pelican had left behind. You took a table in the corner, ordered a cup of coffee, and opened your notebook. The names were arranged in no particular order, and you began by sorting them, those with addresses, those without, those with dates, those with only the barest identifying information. It was slow work, the kind that required patience and attention, the kind that left your mind free to wander through the lives of strangers. Outside, the rain began again, a soft, intermittent drizzle that tapped against the cafe window, its rhythm gentle and unhurried. The barista was playing old jazz on a small radio behind the counter, and the music drifted through the warm, coffee-scented air like a memory of something you had never known. You started with the names that had addresses attached to them. Some were in San Francisco itself, the Mission District, the Richmond, the working-class neighborhoods that had been hardest hit by T. Depression, where families had lined up for bread and men had sold apples on street corners. Others were farther afield, Oakland, Berkeley, small towns in the Central Valley whose names you had never heard before, places where the Dust Bowl had scoured the earth and left nothing behind but hardship. You opened your laptop and began to search for them, one by one, using the public records and genealogical databases and old newspaper archives that were available to anyone with a computer and the patience to look. What you found surprised you. The people on the list were not wealthy. They were not connected. They were not the kind of clients that any respectable bank would have pursued. They were farmers, their hands calloused and their land mortgaged to the hilt. They were small merchants, grocers, tailors, bakers, whose shops had been emptied by the economic collapse. They were widows, left alone to raise children on nothing but grief and determination. They were immigrant families who had arrived in America with nothing but the clothes on their backs and had spent years struggling to build something from the bare earth. They were exactly the kind of people that legitimate banks had refused to lend to during the Depression, the kind of people who had no collateral, no credit history, no wealthy relatives to vouch for them. The kind of people the system had been designed to exclude. And yet, during the darkest years of the 1930s, each of them had received a loan from Pacific Trust. The loans varied in size, some were as small as $50, enough to buy groceries for a month or pay a doctor's bill or keep the electricity running for one more week. Others were larger, in the hundreds, enough to save a farm from foreclosure or keep a small business afloat through the winter or pay for a child's medical treatment. But they all shared two things in common. None of them had ever been reported to a credit agency. None of them had ever been collected. The loans had been given, and then they had been forgotten, not by the recipients, who had carried the memory of that kindness through their lives, but by the institution that had made them. There were no follow-up letters. No payment demands. No threats of legal action. Just the money, and the silence, and the years that followed. You leaned back in your chair. The coffee had gone cold, but you barely noticed. The rain was falling harder now, drumming on the cafe window with a steady, insistent rhythm that seemed to urge you onward. The jazz on the radio had given way to something slower, a piano piece that you vaguely recognized. You turned back to your laptop and kept searching, following the trail of names through the decades. Some of the people on the list had died long ago, their stories lost to time, their descendants scattered across the country like seeds carried by the wind. You found obituaries for some, brief, formal notices that listed their survivors and their accomplishments but made no mention of the mysterious bank that had saved them. Others had descendants who were still living in the same communities, still carrying the same family names, still walking the same streets that their grandparents had walked. You found them in property records and marriage licenses and the sprawling, interconnected web of genealogical databases that had become the modern equivalent of the old family Bible. And one name in particular, a name that appeared near the middle of Pelican's list, written in that same careful, deliberate hand, led you to a small house in a quiet neighborhood in Berkeley. The house was old but well kept, its paint fresh, its garden full of roses that had been pruned and tended with care. The rain had stopped by the time you arrived, and the sun was beginning to break through the clouds in long, golden shafts that made the wet pavement glitter. You knocked on the door. An old woman answered. Her name was Mrs. Castellano. She was in her 80s, her hair white and soft as cotton, her hands gnarled but steady, her eyes pale and clear behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. She looked at you with a calm, unhurried curiosity, the way people do when they have lived long enough to know that unexpected visitors often bring unexpected gifts. She invited you in. The house smelled of fresh bread and lavender and the faint, pleasant mustiness of old wood. She offered you tea, and you accepted, and you sat together in her small, sunlit kitchen while the kettle began to whistle on the stove. You showed her the list. You explained what you had found, the ledger, the warehouse, the hotel room, the shadow bank that had operated in the spaces between the official and the invisible. She listened. Without interrupting, her hands wrapped around her teacup, her expression calm and patient. When you finished, she was silent for a long moment. The clock on the wall ticked its steady, unhurried rhythm. A bird sang somewhere in the garden outside. And then she smiled, a small, quiet smile that seemed to come from a very old and very private memory. My grandmother used to tell a story, she said. She told it so many times that I can still hear her voice. During the worst of the Depression, when my grandfather was out of work and they were about to lose the house, the bank had already sent the final notice. A man came to the door. It was a Sunday afternoon. She remembered that detail. She was in the kitchen, trying to figure out how to feed 4 children with nothing but flour and water. And there was a knock. Mrs. Castellano paused, her pale eyes looking past you, into the past. He was wearing a dark suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He didn't ask them to sign anything. He just handed her an envelope. Inside was enough money to pay the mortgage for 6 months. My grandmother never knew who sent him. She never learned the name of the bank or the man. But she remembered one thing. She looked at you, her eyes clear and bright. The man had a small pin on his lapel. A bird. She said it looked like a pelican. The photograph from Mrs. Castellano's memory stayed with you. The man in the dark suit, the envelope of cash, the small pelican pin on his lapel. It was the first concrete description you had of the person behind the shadow bank. Not a code name. Not a set of initials in a ledger. A real person, who had walked up to a stranger's door and handed over an envelope and asked for nothing in return. You wanted to know who he was. You wanted to put a face to the pelican. The search led you to the San Francisco Public Library, a grand old building with marble steps worn smooth by generations of feet, with high, vaulted ceilings painted with murals of California's history, with the quiet, dusty smell of a million books that had been read and returned and read again. You spent hours in the archives, scrolling through microfilm reels of old newspapers, your eyes growing tired as the pages flickered past in a blur of headlines and advertisements and society columns. The rain had returned, as it always seemed to in this city, drumming softly on the high windows above you, a sound that had become as familiar as your own breathing over these past days. The library was warm and still, the only sounds the gentle hum of the microfilm reader and the occasional rustle of a turning page from somewhere across the room and the distant, muffled footsteps of a librarian reshelving books. You were searching for any mention of Pacific Trust, any reference to the shadow bank that had operated for so many years in the spaces between the official and the invisible. But the name never appeared. Not in the business pages. Not in the financial columns. Not in the lists of bank charters and regulatory filings that were published every quarter. The silence was deliberate, you realized. James Calder, whoever he was, had taken great care to ensure that his institution left no public trace. And then, in a copy of the San Francisco Chronicle from March 1947, you found him. The photograph was on the Society page, a grainy, black and white image that had been reproduced on microfilm and was now projected onto the screen before you. It showed a group of men in dark suits, standing on the steps of a newly built community hospital. The hospital was a modest structure, its brick facade still clean and new, its windows still gleaming. The men were all smiling, their hands clasped before them, their postures formal but relaxed in the way that men of a certain era always seemed to be when they were being photographed. A ribbon-cutting ceremony, the caption explained. The hospital had been funded by private donations, and these were the donors who had made it possible. The caption listed their names. Most were local politicians or businessmen, their titles familiar from other articles you had scanned: a city councilman, the president of a shipping company, a prominent real estate developer. But one man, standing slightly to the side of the group, as if he preferred not to be the center of attention, was identified only as Mr. James Calder, President, Pacific Trust Savings. He was tall and thin, with dark hair combed back from a high forehead and a face that was kind but reserved. And on his lapel, small but unmistakable even in the grainy newsprint, was a pin in the shape of a bird. Its wings were spread wide. Its beak was long and curved. A pelican. You stared at the image for a long moment. The rain drummed softly on the library windows above you. The microfilm reader hummed its quiet, steady note. Here, at last, was the face behind the shadow bank. Not a code name. Not a signature. A man. A man who had stood on the steps of a hospital he had helped to fund, and who had worn his Pelican Pin as if it were the most natural thing in the world. You printed the photograph. The old microfilm printer beside the reader whirred and clicked, its mechanisms older than you were, and after a moment, it produced a slightly curled copy of the image. The paper was warm from the printer's heat, and the photograph, in its physical form, seemed more real than it had on the screen. You held it in your hands and looked at James Calder's face, the kind eyes, the reserved smile, the pelican on his lapel. You searched the name through the library's archives and the online databases that had become your constant companions over these past weeks. You found fragments of his life, scattered through the decades like pieces of a puzzle. He had been born in 1892, the son of a schoolteacher and a seamstress. He had served in the First World War, in a field hospital in France, and had returned home with a quiet demeanor and a determination that those who knew him described as unshakable. He had worked for several legitimate banks in the 1920s, rising through the ranks with a speed that spoke of both talent and ambition. And then, sometime around 1930, he had left the legitimate banking world entirely. The public record of his career simply stopped. No more promotions. No more board appointments. No more mentions in the financial press. He had stepped into the shadows, and he had never stepped back out. You found his obituary, published in the Chronicle in February 1968. It was brief, almost startlingly so for a man who had accomplished what he had. It listed his career in the vaguest possible terms: banker, philanthropist, veteran of the Great War. It noted that he had no wife and no children, that he had lived alone in a modest apartment on Nob Hill, that he had been a member of several charitable organizations whose names you did not recognize. And it listed his only surviving relative, a niece, Margaret Calder, who resided in Seattle. The obituary did not mention Pacific Trust. It did not mention the shadow bank or the secret loans or the anonymous depositors who had funded them. It did not mention the warehouse on the Embarcadero, or the hotel room that had never been checked out of, or the nearly 100 families whose lives had been quietly saved by a man who had asked for nothing in return. Whatever James Calder had done in the shadows of the financial world, whatever secrets he had kept and whatever promises he had made, he had taken them with him to his grave. Let these names settle quietly now. James Calder has been at peace for a very long time. His work is done. His ledgers have been found. You don't need to remember every detail tonight. Close your eyes. Let the sound of the rain on the library roof carry you for a while, gentle and slow, like a hand smoothing down a crumpled page. The story will still be here when you wake. The rain had stopped by the time you left the library. The sky was clearing, the clouds breaking apart to reveal patches of pale, watery blue. The streets were still wet, the pavement glistening under the emerging sunlight, and the air smelled of rain and salt and the faint, sweet scent of the eucalyptus trees that lined the nearby park. You walked slowly, the printed photograph folded in your pocket, the obituary's final line repeating itself in your mind. Survived by a niece, Margaret Calder, of Seattle, Washington. The obituary was from 1968. Margaret would be in her 70s or 80s by now, if she was still alive. But if she was not, her children might be. Her grandchildren. Someone in Seattle might still remember James Calder. Someone might still have his papers, his letters, his photographs. Someone might know why he had built the shadow bank, and why he had spent his life giving away money he never expected to be repaid. And you were already thinking about the road north, and about the niece who might hold the final pieces of the puzzle. The drive north from San Francisco to Seattle took you through landscapes that seemed to shift with every passing hour, the golden hills of California giving way to the misty forests of Oregon, and those, in turn, to the gray, windswept waters of Puget Sound. The rain, which had been your constant companion since the night you first opened the ledger in your study, followed you the entire way. It drummed on the roof of the car, streaked the windshield in silver lines, turned the world outside into a soft, blurred watercolor of green and gray. You drove with the radio off, listening to the rhythm of the rain and the steady hum of the engine, your thoughts drifting through the fragments of the story you had assembled. James Calder. The Pelican Pin. The warehouse on the Embarcadero. The hotel room that had never been checked out of. The list of names from the second ledger. And now, somewhere ahead of you, a woman named Margaret Calder, or her descendants, who might hold the final piece of the puzzle. The road stretched on. You stopped once, at a diner in a small town in southern Oregon, where you sat at the counter and drank a cup of coffee that was too hot and too bitter. Outside, the rain continued its steady, patient rhythm on the parking lot asphalt. The waitress, a woman with gray hair and a name tag that read Dottie, refilled your cup without being asked and gave you a look that seemed to say she had seen travelers like you before, people carrying something heavy, people who were on their way to somewhere that mattered. You thanked her and drove on. Seattle welcomed you with its familiar gray drizzle. The city rose from the shores of the Sound like a collection of glass and steel monuments to the modern world, the Space Needle visible through the mist, the downtown towers reflecting the pale, watery light. But the neighborhood where you found Margaret Calder's last known address was older and quieter, far from the gleaming towers. The streets were lined with craftsmen and houses built in the early decades of the last century, their wide porches and sloping roofs and deep eaves speaking of a time when things were made to last, when houses were built by hands that understood wood and stone and the patient work of craftsmanship. The trees here were tall and old, their branches interlacing overhead to form a canopy that kept the street in a perpetual, gentle twilight. You parked in front of a small blue house with white trim and a garden full of rhododendrons, their blossoms heavy with rain, their petals scattered on the wet grass beneath them. You walked up the front path, feeling the familiar weight of the ledger in your bag. The porch steps creaked beneath your feet, and the sound seemed to announce your arrival before you had even knocked. The door was opened by a woman who was not Margaret Calder. She was younger, in her 50s, perhaps, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a loose ponytail and the same kind, steady eyes you had seen in the photograph of James Calder on the hospital steps. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, and there was a smudge of flour on her cheek, as if you had interrupted her in the middle of baking. She looked at you with a calm, unhurried curiosity, the way people do when they have lived long enough to know that unexpected visitors often bring unexpected gifts. Her name was Sarah. She invited you in, and you accepted. The house was warm and smelled of fresh bread and cinnamon and the faint, pleasant mustiness of old wood. The furniture was comfortable and well-worn, the kind that had been lived with for decades and would be lived with for decades more. Photographs lined the walls, children growing up, graduations, weddings, the quiet accumulation of a family's history. In the corner of the living room, a grandfather clock ticked its steady, patient rhythm, marking the passage of time in a room that had seen many such afternoons. You sat together in her kitchen, at a wooden table that had been scrubbed clean by years of use. She poured you a cup of tea, and you wrapped your hands around the warm ceramic, feeling the heat seep into your fingers. And then you explained why you had come. You told her about the auction, about the ledger, about the warehouse in San Francisco and the hotel room that had never been checked out of. You showed her the photograph of James Calder on the hospital steps, the Pelican Pin glinting on his lapel. You showed her the list of names from the second ledger, nearly 100 of them, each one a life that had been touched by the shadow bank. You too. LD her about your great-grandmother, whose name had appeared on that list, and about the miracle that had a name after all. Sarah listened quietly, her hands wrapped around her own cup of tea, her expression calm and thoughtful. She did not interrupt. She did not ask questions. She simply listened, with the patience of someone who had been waiting for a story like this one for a very long time. The rain tapped gently against the kitchen window, a sound that seemed to wrap itself around a silence rather than break it. The clock in the living room chimed the half hour, its notes low and resonant. When you finished, Sarah was silent for a long moment. She looked down at her tea, and then she looked up at you. My grandmother used to tell me stories about her Uncle James, she said quietly. She called him, the man who did secret good. She said he had a soft spot for people who had nowhere else to turn. She told me once that he had given away most of his money before he died, but that no one ever knew where it went. I never really understood what she meant. But I think I do now. She paused, her eyes drifting to the window, to the rain and the gray sky beyond. She always said that one day, someone would come looking for him. Someone who had found his books. I thought it was just a story. She rose from the table and gestured for you to follow her. She led you up a narrow staircase to the attic, a warm, dusty space beneath the sloping eaves, filled with the accumulated belongings of a family's history. Old trunks and cardboard boxes, stacks of magazines from the 1950s, a child's rocking horse with its paint worn thin. The air smelled of old paper and cedar and the faint, sweet scent of lavender. In the corner, half hidden beneath a stack of faded quilts, was a leather trunk. It was old but well made, its brass fittings tarnished but intact, its leather surface darkened with age. Sarah knelt beside it and opened the lid. Inside were the remnants of James Calder's life, the things that Margaret had kept, the things that she had wanted to pass on. A stack of ledgers, identical to the one you carried, their pages filled with the same careful, deliberate handwriting. A bundle of letters tied with a faded silk ribbon, the paper yellowed but still intact. A small wooden box containing a pelican-shaped lapel pin, its silver tarnished but still bright, the bird's wings spread wide as if in flight. Photographs: James Calder as a young man in his army uniform, James Calder standing in front of the warehouse on the Embarcadero, James Calder at a dinner with people you did not recognize but whose faces looked kind. And at the very bottom of the trunk, sealed in an envelope that had never been opened, its wax still intact, was a letter. The envelope was addressed, in handwriting you recognized, to whoever finds the ledgers. The ink had faded to a pale, watery brown, but the words were still clear. Your hands were steady as you picked it up. The paper was heavy, the envelope thick with age. You slid your thumb beneath the flap, breaking the seal for the first time since James Calder had pressed it closed, decades ago. The letter inside was written on a single sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle at the edges. The handwriting was James Calder's, the same careful, deliberate hand that had filled the ledgers for so many years. Each letter was formed with precision and care, as if he had understood that these words would be his last, and that they might matter to someone he would never meet. If you are reading this, the letter began, then the work of the shadow bank is complete. The ledgers have been found. The names have been remembered. And now, the choice falls to you. The rain continued its gentle tapping against the attic window. Sarah stood quietly beside you. And you read on, feeling the weight of the decades settle around you like a blanket, feeling the presence of a man who had spent his life giving away money he never expected to be repaid, and who had trusted that someone, someday, would understand why. The letter from James Calder lay open on the small desk in your Seattle hotel room. Outside, the rain continued its gentle, persistent rhythm against the window glass, the same rain that had followed you from San Francisco, from the auction house, from the very first night you had opened the ledger and found those impossible words. This institution is not governed by the Federal Reserve Act. All transactions are settled in gold. It felt like a lifetime ago. It felt like yesterday. The road you had traveled, from the dusty barn in the countryside to the warehouse on the Embarcadero, from the hushed elegance of the St. Francis Hotel to the quiet Craftsman House in Seattle, had brought you here, to this moment, to this letter, to this choice. The hotel room was small and quiet. The radiator in the corner hummed its familiar metallic song, a sound that had accompanied you through so many nights of this journey. The lamp on the desk cast a warm amber pool of light across the letter and your hands and the worn leather cover of the ledger, which you had placed beside it. The rain tapped gently on the window, its rhythm unhurried and patient, as if it too was waiting for you to decide. You had read the letter 3 times now, each pass revealing something new. Calder's handwriting was careful and deliberate, the same hand that had filled the ledgers for more than 30 years, the loans, the deposits, the code names of the anonymous benefactors. But there was something different in the letter, something that the formal columns of numbers had only hinted at. A warmth. A humanity. He wrote not as a banker, but as a man who had seen suffering and had decided, quietly and without fanfare, to do something about it. The shadow bank, he explained, had been founded in the autumn of 1930 by a group of businessmen who had watched the Great Depression destroy their communities. They were not radicals or revolutionaries. They were not anarchists or communists or any of the other labels the fearful had attached to anyone who questioned the system in those years. They were simply men who had money, some had inherited it, some had earned it, some had simply been lucky, and who could not bear to stand by while their neighbors lost everything. They had seen the bread lines and the bank failures and the families evicted from their homes, and they had decided that the system, whatever its virtues, was not enough. It was not reaching the people who needed it most. So they built their own system. They pooled their private wealth, created a network of anonymous deposits and interest-free loans, and operated it in the spaces between the official and the invisible. The bank had no charter, Calder wrote. No license. No official existence in the eyes of the state or the federal government. But it had never broken any law, it had simply operated outside them. It had never sought profit, never charged interest, never collected a debt that could not be repaid. It was a gift, he wrote. Not a business. Not an investment. A gift. And like any gift, it was meant to be given, not displayed. He explained the code names, Bluebird, Sparrow, Raven, Nightingale, as the aliases of the original founders, men who had wished to remain anonymous not out of shame but out of a quiet, old-fashioned belief that charity should be done in private. He explained the warehouse on the Embarcadero as a way station, a place where goods and money could be stored and transferred without attracting attention. He explained the hotel room as a meeting place, where the depositors and the borrowers could come together without ever knowing each other's names. And he explained the Pelican Pin as a symbol of sacrifice, of nourishment, of the ancient legend that a pelican would feed its young with its own blood if no other food could be found. It was a fitting emblem, he wrote, for a bank that had never expected to be repaid. The rain continued its steady, patient rhythm against the window. You set the letter down for a moment and looked out at the gray Seattle sky, at the wet streets below and the distant lights of the harbor and the dark, restless water of Puget Sound. A ferry was making its way across the bay, its lights blurred and softened by the rain. The world outside was quiet and still, as if it too was holding its breath. And then, in the final paragraphs of the letter, James Calder gave you the choice. The list of names, he wrote, the nearly 100 people who had been helped by the shadow bank, was now in your possession. You could publish those names. You could tell the world what had been done in the darkness of the Depression. You could bring the story of Pacific Trust into the light, so that the families who had been helped could know the truth, and so that the men who had given their wealth could be remembered. Or you could destroy the list. You could let the secret die with you, so that the descendants of those families would never have to wonder why a stranger had once saved them, never have to carry the weight of a debt they had not known they owed. Either choice, Calder wrote, was the right one. He had not asked you to keep the secret. He had not asked you to reveal it. He had simply asked you to choose. You sat with the letter for a long time. The rain came and went, its rhythm shifting from soft to insistent and back again. The radiator clicked and hummed. The ferry disappeared into the mist. You thought about your great-grandmother, whose name was on that list, the woman who had lost everything in the crash and had, according to family legend, miraculously kept her house. The miracle, you now knew, had been a man in a dark suit with a pelican on his lapel. Did her descendants need to know that? Did it matter, after all these years, where the money had come from? Or was the simple fact of the kindness enough? You thought about Mrs. Castellano, the old woman in Berkeley, who still remembered the story her grandmother had told her about the stranger who had come to the door. She had lived her whole life not knowing who that stranger was, and she had lived it well. Would knowing change anything? Would it add something to her life, or would it take something away? You thought about Sarah, the woman in Seattle who had opened her attic and shared her family's secrets with a stranger. She had trusted you with the trunk and the letter and the Pelican Pin. She had trusted you to make the right choice. And you understood, as the rain tapped gently on the window and the radiator hummed its quiet song, that this decision was not about history or justice or the public's right to know. It was about people. Real people, whose lives had been touched by a kindness they never fully understood. Did they need the world to know what had been done for them? Or did they simply need to know that someone, once, in the darkness of a very dark time, had cared enough to help? You sat down at the desk and began to write. Not a decision, not yet. But a letter of your own, to Sarah, to the woman who had given you the key to the trunk and the story that it contained. You would tell her what you had learned. You would tell her about the choice that James Calder had left in your hands. And you would ask her what she thought should be done. Because some choices, you realized, were not meant to be made alone. The decision came to you not as a thunderclap, but as a quiet settling. Like the rain that had been falling since the night you first opened the ledger, steady, patient, unhurried. It had been with you through every step of this journey, from the dusty barn where you had found the book to the warehouse on the Embarcadero to the hotel room that had never been checked out of to the attic in Seattle where a woman named Sarah had opened a trunk and shared her family's secrets. And now, at the end of all those miles, it was still here, still falling, still softening the edges of the world. You had spoken with Sarah at length in the days after you opened James Calder's letter. You had returned to her house twice, sitting in her warm kitchen while the afternoon light faded and the rain tapped gently against the window glass and the grandfather clock in the living room marked the passing hours with its steady, resonant chime. The smell of fresh bread and cinnamon still hung in the air, a quiet, domestic comfort that seemed to belong to this house and this family and this moment. You had told her about the choice that Calder had left in your hands, the option to bring the story of the shadow bank into the light, to publish the names and the ledgers and the letters, or to let it rest in the darkness where it had lived for so many years. She had listened quietly, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her expression calm and thoughtful. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back in the same loose ponytail, and she wore the same simple sweater. There was flour on her hands this time, from a loaf of bread she had been kneading when you arrived. She did not interrupt. She did not rush to offer an opinion. She simply listened, with the same patience that her great-granduncle must have possessed, the same willingness to let a story unfold at its own pace. When you finished, she was silent for a long moment. The rain tapped on the window. The clock ticked in the living room. And then she said, very quietly, "I think you wanted us to protect them. The people on the list." They've lived their whole lives not knowing. Maybe that's the gift. Maybe the gift is not having to carry the weight of it. She paused, looking down at her tea, and then she looked up at you. If it were me, if my great-grandmother had been on that list, I would want to know. But that's me. Not everyone is the same. And I don't think we have the right to decide for them. You had nodded. Somewhere deep in your own heart, you had already known the answer. The shadow bank had never been about recognition. It had never been about legacy or fame or the public's right to know. James Calder and his anonymous partners, Bluebird, Sparrow, Raven, Nightingale, had not given their money in the hope that someday someone would thank them. They had given it because it was the right thing to do. Because they had seen suffering and could not look away. Because they believed, with a quiet, unshakable conviction, that the measure of a life was not what you accumulated but what you gave away. To shout that kindness from the rooftops now, to expose the names of those who had been helped, and the names of their descendants, and the private struggles they had endured, would be to betray the very spirit of the gift itself. The people on the list had been given something precious, not just money, but dignity. They had been helped without being asked to prove their worthiness. They had been saved without being asked to sign anything. To reveal their names now would be to take that dignity away, to replace the quiet grace of an anonymous gift with the public spectacle of a story. And yet, to destroy the ledgers entirely, to burn them, as Calder had half suggested in his letter, felt wrong as well. The ledgers were a record. A testament. They were proof that even in the darkest years of the Depression, even when the system had failed and the banks had closed and the bread lines had stretched around city blocks, there were people who had refused to accept that suffering was inevitable. The ledgers deserved to be preserved. Not as a spectacle. As a reminder. So you made your choice. You would donate the materials, the ledgers, the letters, the photographs, the Pelican Pin, to a museum. Not a large museum, not one of the grand institutions that drew crowds and generated headlines. A quiet museum, dedicated to the history of American finance, run by scholars who understood. That some stories were meant to be told softly. You contacted them from your hotel room, your voice steady as you explained what you had found. The curator, a woman with a calm, measured voice, listened without interruption. And when you finished, she said, "We would be honored to preserve this. And we will honor your conditions. The names will be redacted. The borrowers will remain anonymous. The story will be told, but the people it touched will be protected." The day of the donation was a Tuesday. The rain had stopped for the first time in what felt like weeks, and the sky over the city was a pale, watery blue, streaked with clouds that glowed faintly in the morning light. You carried the box of materials into the museum yourself, the ledgers wrapped in their oilcloth, the letters tied with their faded ribbon, the Pelican Pin in its small wooden box. The museum was housed in an old building in the financial district, its marble floors worn smooth by generations of visitors, its high ceilings painted with murals of the city's history. The air smelled of old paper and floor wax and the faint, pleasant mustiness of a library. The archivist who met you in the lobby was a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and a calm, steady gaze. She introduced herself, and as she spoke, you noticed her last name on the ID badge clipped to the lapel of her cardigan. It was a name you recognized. It was on the list. She was the great-granddaughter of one of the borrowers, a farmer in the Central Valley who had received a loan from Pacific Trust in the spring of 1934, enough to save his land from foreclosure. You had read his name in the second ledger, written in James Calder's careful hand. Forgiven, the margin note had said. She did not know why you had come. She did not know what was in the box. She knew only that a donor had arrived with materials for the archive, and that it was her job to receive them. She smiled at you, a professional, courteous smile, and reached out to take the box from your hands. You did not tell her. The words rose in your throat, and for a moment, you considered saying something. Your great-grandfather was helped by a stranger. A man with a pelican on his lapel came to his door and saved his farm and asked for nothing in return. His name is in this book. Your name is connected to this story. But you did not say any of that. Because the gift had been given in silence, and it deserved to remain in silence. NCE. Because the young woman before you had lived her whole life not knowing, and she had lived it well, and she did not need the weight of an old kindness to change the shape of her days. Because James Calder had trusted you to make the right choice, and the right choice was to let the gift remain what it had always been, a quiet, invisible thread connecting one generation to the next. The rain was waiting for you when you returned home. It had been falling, it seemed, for as long as you had been away, a soft, steady drizzle that had kept the streets wet and the gutters running and the world wrapped in its familiar, gray embrace. The driveway was slick with moisture, the gravel crunching wetly beneath your tires as you pulled in. The trees that lined your street had shed most of their leaves, and the bare branches glistened with droplets that caught the pale amber glow of the street lamps. You stepped through the front door, set down your bag on the worn wooden floor, and stood for a moment in the quiet of your own house, listening to the sound of the rain on the roof. It was the same sound that had accompanied you through every step of this journey. The night you opened the ledger. The morning of the auction, when the rain had drummed on the tin roof of the old barn. The long hours in the library, scrolling through microfilm while the rain fell on the high windows above you. The drive north through the mountains, the windshield wipers keeping their steady time. The quiet afternoons in Sarah's kitchen, where the rain had tapped gently against the glass while you spoke of secrets and choices and the weight of old kindnesses. The rain had been with you through all of it, a constant, patient companion, asking nothing, offering everything. The house smelled of old wood and dust and the faint, sweet scent of the lavender sachets you had placed in the drawers years ago and had long since forgotten about. Everything was as you had left it, and yet everything felt different. The books on the shelves seemed to wait with a new patience. The clock on the mantel still ticked its steady, unhurried rhythm, marking the passage of time in a room that had seen you leave as one person and return as another. The desk by the window, where the ledger had sat on that first night, its leather cover dark and worn, its brass corners catching the amber glow of the desk lamp, was still there, waiting, as it had always been waiting. You walked to the desk and set down the bag you had carried across so many miles. Your shoulders ached with a familiar, pleasant tiredness, the tiredness of a journey completed, of questions answered, of a story that had found its ending. From inside the bag, you drew out the objects that had become the markers of this journey, the relics of a pilgrimage you had not known you were making. The brass key, its number 3 still faintly visible on the handle, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling, first by James Calder, then by whoever had placed it in the binding of the ledger, and finally by you. The Pelican Pin, its silver tarnished but still bright, the bird's wings spread wide as if in perpetual flight, its tiny eyes seeming to watch you with a calm, beneficent gaze. And the ledger itself, the first ledger, the one that had started it all, its pages filled with the careful, deliberate handwriting of a man who had given away his fortune and asked for nothing in return. You placed them on the desk before you, arranging them with the care of someone handling sacred objects. The key to the left. The pin in the center. The book to the right. 3 objects, small and quiet, that contained within them the entire story of a bank that had never existed and a kindness that had never been recorded. The ride. And continued its steady, patient rhythm on the windowsill, a sound that seemed to wrap itself around the silence rather than break it. The clock on the mantel ticked on. The world outside was gray and still, the street lamps just beginning to flicker on in the gathering dusk. You sat down in the chair by the window. It was the same chair you had been sitting in on the night you first opened the ledger, when the rain had been falling just as it was now, and the words on the first page had made your breath catch in your throat. This institution is not governed by the Federal Reserve Act. All transactions are settled in gold. It felt like a lifetime ago. It felt like yesterday. You looked out at the rain, at the wet leaves on the sidewalk, at the distant lights of the town blurred and softened by the mist. The street was empty. The houses across the road were dark, their occupants asleep or settling in for the night. The world was quiet, and you were quiet with it. You thought about the people whose names were in the ledger. The farmers who had kept their land because a stranger had believed in them. The widows who had fed their children because someone had reached out in the dark. The immigrant families who had built new lives in a new country because a bank that did not exist had given them a chance that no legitimate bank would offer. They had lived their lives not knowing where the money had come from. They had raised their children and paid their debts and passed on, and the secret of their salvation had passed with them. But they had been seen. They had been helped. And now, because of the choices you had made, their stories would be preserved, quietly, gently, their names redacted, their privacy protected, in the archives of a museum that understood the value of silence. You thought about James Calder, the man with the pelican on his lapel, who had stood on the steps of a hospital in 1947 and smiled for a photograph and then gone back to his quiet work of saving people. He had no children. He had no legacy in the conventional sense. But he had left behind a ledger, and a letter, and a choice. And you had made that choice, and you were at peace with it. You thought about Sarah, the woman in Seattle who had opened her attic and her family's history to a stranger. She had given you the key to the trunk, and in doing so, she had given you the final piece of the puzzle. You had written to her, after the donation, to tell her what you had done and why. She had written back, a short note, just a few lines, in her careful, sloping handwriting. "Thank you," it said. "I think Uncle James would have been proud." There is a kind of wealth, you realized, that is never recorded in any ledger. It is not measured in dollars or gold or the value of assets held in trust. It is not tracked by accountants or audited by regulators or reported to the tax authorities. It is measured in the darkness of a winter night, when a hand reaches out and offers what it can, not for recognition or repayment, but simply because it is the right thing to do. James Calder had understood that. The anonymous depositors, Bluebird, Sparrow, Raven, Nightingale, had understood that. The men and women who had carried the envelopes of cash to the doors of strangers, who had worn pelican pins on their lapels and asked for nothing in return, had understood that. And now, sitting at your desk with the rain tapping softly on the glass and the objects of their lives arranged before you, you understood it too. The rain continued its gentle, patient rhythm against the window. You leaned back in your chair and closed your eyes, letting the sound wash over you like water, like time, like the slow, steady breathing of the world. The ledger was closed. The key was still. The pelican on its pin seemed to watch over the room with its quiet, beneficent gaze, a guardian of secrets that had finally been told. And you knew that somewhere, in the archives of a museum on the other side of the country, the names of those who had been helped were waiting, not for recognition, not for thanks, not for the applause of a world that had never known they existed, but simply for someone to read. That they had once been here, and that someone had once cared enough to reach out in the dark. Perhaps, on some other rainy night, not tonight, but someday, you would open the ledger again. You would turn through its yellowed pages and read the names that had been written there so long ago, in ink that had faded to a soft, watery brown. And you would remember them. Not as borrowers or debtors or recipients of charity, but as people, whose lives had been touched by a kindness they never fully understood. They were not forgotten. They were not anonymous. They were written in the pages of a book that had been waiting for someone to find it, and you had found it. You had carried it across mountains and cities and years. And now, at the end of the road, you had brought it home. The rain fell. The clock ticked. The house settled into its familiar quiet, the old timbers creaking softly as the night grew cool. The street lamps outside glowed their steady amber, their light blurred and softened by the rain on the glass. The world was at peace. And you, at the end of the long road that had begun with a box of old books in a country auction, closed your eyes and let the sound of the rain carry you into rest. Good night.